Hi, I'm David Freudberg. This podcast derives from the Humankind public radio series, which I began hosting back in 1997. Our program recognizes how hard it can be, but also how necessary, for us to hold on to our humanity. So we've sought out people with stories that illustrate how they approach that quest. To aim high, to treat others as we'd like to be treated, to see others as more similar to us than different, to strive for patience and personal grace even in adversity, to be part of the solution, not the problem. We hope our podcast helps to reinforce and inspire your own quest. Thank you. Humankind is produced in association with WGBH Boston and supported by the Humankind Program Fund and a special grant from the Henry Luce Foundation.
Forgiveness is a choice and a decision to really see the situation differently. So in other words, if somebody harms me, see them in a way that allows me to disentangle myself emotionally from that person's confusion.
Cultivating the capacity for forgiveness, not to vindicate someone's misconduct, but to become free of it. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. Clinging to a grudge can do more harm to us than the people we resent. Emotional retaliation may be tempting, but it's never deeply satisfying, says author Robin Casarjian, who had to learn how to forgive in her own life and has since widely taught the practice of forgiveness. And besides, she points out, a well-nursed grudge has the unintended effect of locking us into a bitter experience.
Forgiveness really allows us to let go of the past. The need to let go of the past is such a fundamental human need so that we can be present and fully alive in the moment. And, I often think of anger and resentment when we hold on to it. It's like having a handcuff around our wrist and being handcuffed to the person toward whom we feel that resentment. And there's a way in which we're bound and attached to that person in almost like a permanent way, consciously or unconsciously.
Whether we're struggling with a personal relationship or with someone we work with, bitterness usually arises after we've been hurt. But wallowing in hostility rarely contributes to a solution and doesn't heal the wound. In fact, it usually aggravates things.
And if you look at the derivation of the word resentment, it comes from to feel again. So when we resent, we feel again and again and again the pain and the hurt of the past. So the question is, how can we let go of that so we can go on in being free in our lives?
Today, Robin Casarjian directs the Lionheart Foundation in the Boston area. It provides training in emotional literacy to prisoners, teenage moms, and at-risk youth. Early in her career, Robin worked as a consultant to companies seeking to promote employee wellness. She focused on helping workers reduce the consequences of stress. Robin noticed that many people with aggravated symptoms of stress were also walking around with deep-seated resentments. Her research into the problem led to publication in 1992 of Forgiveness, A Bold Choice for a Peaceful Heart, one of the first and most popular books to study this topic in depth.
Well, there's been an explosion in the investigation of forgiveness since that time. Whole departments and universities have built up around this exploration of forgiveness.
Why do you think there's been this surge of interest in forgiveness kind of all of a sudden?
That's a great question. I think that once the research started to be done, people saw that this was a dynamic that had profound implications for people's well-being and physical health. Even connections between people forgiving and significant increases in immune functioning, again, among HIV, people with HIV.
The psychoneuroimmunology
That's right.
of forgiveness
Right.
can change the physiological patterns of the body.
Exactly. And that's a field that's exploded, psychoneuroimmunology and the mind-body connection. So it all came along together.
One reason Robin Casarjian emphasized the teaching of forgiveness is she saw that people who were stuck in resentments lacked basic knowledge and skills for how to dig their way out of the dilemma.
They didn't see forgiveness as an option for themselves because so many of us, well, when you think about it, people often feel, I'm not going to forgive them after what they've done. The implication of that being, I'm not going to do that person a favor. Not realizing that forgiveness is a favor that we do for ourselves. We do it to release ourselves from the negative power, in a sense, that somebody has over us. When we begin to realize that forgiveness is an act of self-interest, it's something that we do for ourselves in order to free ourselves, and it has nothing to do with doing a person a favor. The favor is one that we do for ourselves.
But in forgiving someone who's wronged us, are we not, in effect, letting them off the hook?
Well, David, that's a great question. And when I teach about it, and I always start with what forgiveness is not, rather than what forgiveness is. And I feel like it's very important to clarify that so that people are more open to that possibility of forgiving. And forgiveness is not condoning somebody's hurtful or abusive behavior. It's not excusing it. It's not diminishing the impact of it. It doesn't mean that we repress our anger when we're really feeling angry. It doesn't mean that we act in a particular way. So in other words, I can forgive a friend from whom I've been estranged, and it doesn't mean that I have to call them up and say, let's get together Friday night or do anything in particular. I can forgive a person and litigate if I feel like that's what I need to do. I
forgive you, but I sue you?
That's right. I forgive you, but I sue you. And in doing that, the I forgive you is I am not going to carry this emotional burden because you have shown up in a particular way. I'm going to begin to distance myself from taking your behavior so personally, even though I may be the receptor of it, in a way that allows me to see this. Forgiveness is a choice and a decision to really see the situation differently. So in other words, if somebody harms me, do I see them as, how could they disrespect me that way, and taking it in a deeply personal way rather than perhaps seeing it, wow, this is a person who's confused, ignorant, not in a judgmental way necessarily ignorant, but somebody who's really wounded emotionally. That doesn't mean I excuse their behavior. It doesn't mean I don't call them on it. It doesn't mean I don't set clear, non-negotiable boundaries when necessary. But it does mean that I see them in a way that allows me to disentangle myself emotionally from that person's confusion. Again, I don't give them the power to impact me so negatively.
Many people struggle with resentments after a marriage or relationship breaks up. One woman said it was almost as if she needed permission to stop hating, because being mired in rancor and grudge-holding can be remarkably draining. And at one level, forgiveness can be a simple act, a decision to change an attitude and let go. Robin Casarjian.
a lot of times when I've worked with women and talked about forgiveness, they'll say, so many of them come out of abusive relationships. And they say, I forgave my boyfriend and took him back. And I said, look, forgiving doesn't mean being naive and not seeing the situation clearly. You can forgive them, but if they aren't about change and they're abusive, get out of the relationship. Again, it's not about what you do, it's where you come from in what you do.
So what would it mean in a conflict like that, where you actually forgive someone but say, I'm leaving the relationship? Those are not incompatible.
They are not incompatible at all. What it means is that obviously in an abusive relationship, if you're taking care of yourself, you know that you need to get out of the relationship. Again, if that person isn't willing to take full responsibility for what they've done and really make an effort to change, not just, I take responsibility, I'm so sorry, and meanwhile they're not committed to really looking at their behavior and changing it in some fundamental way. I love what this Reverend author Wayne Muller says, and I think this might clarify, in a way, the question that you asked. He said, what we are forgiving is not the act, the abuse or the insensitivity, or wherever it may fall on a scale of hurtful. He said, what we are forgiving is not the act. What we are forgiving is the people who could not manage to honor and cherish themselves, oftentimes their own spouses, their own mate, their own children, or other people, whomever. What we are forgiving is their confusion, their unskillfulness, their ignorance, and sometimes even their desperation. So in a way, there's an expression, forgiving all is understanding all. It's like we understand that it's their separation from the part of them that is loving and wise and fundamentally good, their separation, that they're being propelled by some kind of, emotional force within themselves. And again, it's when we can step back and see that, we don't have to take it in what is often really an exaggerated personal way. It isn't about us necessarily. It's just about the way that they show up. And then we have to make choices that serve us in terms of honoring ourselves so that we don't stay in a relationship that's abusive, or we're able to distance ourselves. Say we have a boss who's kind of abusive, but we're not going to leave our work. How can we try to set boundaries and show up in a way that we don't allow ourselves to be perpetually emotionally ground down by the way that person happens to show up in life?
And that requires being centered enough in ourselves so that the fluctuations from somebody else, the desperation that someone else visits upon us doesn't have to knock us off our center.
Right, or it knocks us off our center, but we're able to get up much more quickly. And life is like a stone mill. It will either grind you down or it will polish you up. In which it does is ultimately up to you. And with people that are difficult in our life, they will grind us down or polish us up by our willingness to make a commitment to seeing the person and the situation from a different perspective.
We're exploring the sometimes difficult process of forgiving people who we feel have wronged us, and the liberating effects of moving beyond the cycle of feeling hurt and clinging to resentment. My guest, Robin Casarjian, is author of Forgiveness, a Bold Choice for a Peaceful Heart. recent years, she has taken her message to prisoners, many of whom bear the scars of emotional wounds inflicted at a young age. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. For more information on this segment, The Practice of Forgiveness with Robin Casarjian, please visit humanmedia.org. When you mentioned a moment ago the desperation of the person who is harmful to others and forgiving them that, not forgiving the harmful act, but the fact that they don't at that moment seem to be capable of anything better. I do find that very often bad actors or people who are antisocial or people who are very inconsiderate do bring a certain desperation to their emotional interactions with others that hampers their ability to be kind and socially responsible.
Right. So the issue for us is, are we going to let somebody that's like that dominate our own emotional response? You know, we may get triggered into whatever, but a day later, a week later, a month later, are we going to be having all these negative emotions because of that, the way that person is showing up?
Because we carry it with us long after the actual encounter that had upset us originally.
Exactly. Rather than standing back and seeing, wow, this person has limitations. And again, that doesn't mean that I hesitate to set clear, non-negotiable boundaries with the person if I need to do that. I'm able to step back to the part of myself which is more centered, clearer, can see that, wow, they're really dominated by fear and anger themselves, or some way of showing up that's really limited and ultimately fear-based. And I'm able to, the most positive scenario is I can come from that part of myself that can see clearly, and maybe I can address that issue with them and say, hey, you know, when you show up this way, this is the way I feel affected. Interact with them in a way where I express the truth of my experience, not to the part of them that's being controlling and negative, but making an assumption that there's a wise and responsive person in them.
And that can be pretty hard if you're dealing with somebody who has just behaved like a real jerk.
Absolutely. Now, the happiest scenario is that they can respond to you because you're not talking to the part of them that's a quote-unquote jerk, but you're making an assumption that maybe they don't really want to be that way either, but that's a survival mechanism for them to show up in this controlling, manipulative way all the time.
Something they learned as a kid.
Right, exactly. And so the happiest scenario is they can respond to that. And I want to say that even if they respond, if it's a habitual pattern for someone to show up in this way, they're certainly going to get triggered back into that. And that forgiveness with people who we have ongoing relationships with is rarely, if ever, a one-time event. So one might feel like, well, I kind of forgave them and then they got that way and I'm going to just hold on to my resentment again. That's where they're going to grind you down. But they can polish you up by coming back to that, what I call the core self, that part of you that is centered and wise, and seeing that there is more to them that meets the eye. There is a decent person in them, and I'm not going to let their woundedness perpetually leave me in my own anger and resentment towards them.
The polishing up process described by Robin Casarjian includes going deeper into understanding your own reactions to the other person. When the resentment is triggered, it may be easiest to erupt into anger. But underneath that, says Robin, you're very likely feeling something else, maybe scared or sad or insecure or even abandoned. These emotions may not be fully conscious, but getting a handle on what's driving our reactions is crucial to transforming them, within the realistic limits, that is, of the relationship that's being tested.
If you find the situation intolerable, maybe you can literally leave the situation. Maybe you get a transfer, maybe there's some kind of change. However, if that doesn't happen, you still have a choice to be ground down or be polished up, where you make that decision. And I think that in order to do this, when you're with a difficult person day in and day out, you really have to do some centering and self-nurturing in order to connect with that part of yourself.
Because that constant assault can really deplete us otherwise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think the need to center and to do self-nurturing things is so incredibly important for anyone in any circumstance. I mean, we live in such a fast-paced, outer-directed world that the need to align with that part of ourselves that's calmer and clearer and wiser than living life in a state of reactivity. And it's critically important when we are around difficult people, because if we don't do something to center and nurture ourselves, then we are almost just bound to get lost out in our anger and our resentment. Whatever it is that nurtures ourselves, being, taking a nice long walk in nature, meditating, reading books that inspire us, doing things that will help us to be able to, again, disentangle ourselves and not get lost in a victim story.
And is there a connection between not forgiving someone and feeling like I'm the victim of that person's misconduct?
Absolutely, because if you hold on to anger and resentment, who's responsible for your feeling miserable? They are. And if they're responsible, you're the victim. And what you're trying to do is make this shift where you say, I am responsible. And the way I see this person and circumstance is going to either make me the victim in my story, or as Fred Luskin says, make me the hero in my story. I know which one I would prefer to be. And again, it takes, if you're perpetually around difficult people, it does take a real commitment. And I would say to people, get books that reinforce this way of seeing and do things to, again, align with that part of yourself that helps you to see clearly, so that you are the hero. You're not the victim of somebody because they happen to be emotionally immature or wounded.
How important is it to forgive oneself?
I think it's critical if one wants to be peaceful and happy. I mean, we can't go around just blaming ourselves. And in that same way that I spoke about where Wayne Muller said, what we are forgiving is not the act. We're not saying the act is okay, that what we did is okay. But we realize that, I was probably acting out of my own fear and sadness or whatever when I did those, in my own ignorance. Again, not using that word in a judgmental way, but we begin to open our hearts to ourselves, to have more compassion. I did the best I could in that moment with the level of fear or wisdom that I was coming from. And to begin to just really, I think forgiveness is that process of opening up our hearts to ourselves and just saying, okay, what can I learn from this? how can I take responsibility for, is there anybody I need to make amends with? Is there business I need to clean up from the things that I'm holding myself guilty for? And the golden rule of all the work I do is be gentle with yourself. Beating yourself up is not usually a very useful thing to do, so that we can not get lost in our low self-esteem, a shame for what we've done. And those things will arise. They'll arise, but we can just see them, come back to that part in ourselves again, where we can keep our heart open to ourselves and go on in life, being able to touch the peace and the joy and the power that is core to who we are as human beings.
Do you think God forgives people who make mistakes?
I don't know that God needs to forgive anybody. I don't even think God forgives. I don't think that there's a judgment to begin with. That's how I feel about it. It's.
You mean unconditional love?
Yeah.
Need not even forgive.
Absolutely. We if there's some being or out there that's observing us, they see that if a person is acting in a way that's less than loving, that's motivated by their own confusion and fear. Ultimately, that's not something that necessarily needs to be judged. It's just something that is.
Do you think there's a connection between the ability to forgive oneself for mistakes that we make and the ability to forgive others for the mistakes they make?
Yes, I do. And I think it goes both ways. Sometimes people say, do you have to forgive yourself before you can forgive others? Do you have to forgive others? I think of it, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Who knows? But the more you do one, the more compassion and the more compassion you'll have for yourself or the other person. And the more one forgives, it's like a prophylactic for forgiving in the future. It's like the more you are able to reframe situations and see them in a way where you see the fundamental dynamic of what's going on and you begin to extricate yourself. I often say the ego loves to take things personally. But
that's the ego's raison d'etre?
That's right. That's right. But the self, it doesn't take things personally. It just sees things for what they are.
The higher self.
The higher self, right. The higher self, the core self, the spiritual self. I kind of use those words interchange. But that part of us that just is wise and can step back. The part of us that is a witness, that can see, not a witness that's emotionally disentangled, but the part of us that can witness, that when we're aligned with that witness, we see things with greater love and compassion and clarity.
Aligned with the witness.
Aligned with the witness, right.
Robin Casarjian, Executive Director of the Lionheart Foundation in Boston and author of Houses of Healing and Forgiveness, a Bold Choice for a Peaceful Heart. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. Studio recording by Antonio Oliart Rose. Editorial assistance from Mark Kilstein, Thomas Royal, and Kathy Graham. Webmaster Brian K. Johnson. Special thanks to Tony Buck. Our program is presented by Human Media in association with Connie Goldman Productions. Program development provided by Shart Media.
You can hear more episodes of our series at humankindpodcast.org. That's humankindpodcast.org.
This segment, part one of The Practice of Forgiveness with Robin Casarjian, is Humankind Program number 204.
The executive producer is David Freudberg. Please subscribe to our free weekly podcast. The title is Humankind on Public Radio. You can find it at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, NPR One, and all major podcast services, as well as through our website. Again, the podcast title is Humankind on Public Radio. And if you'd like to support our program, please visit humankindpodcast.org, and at the top, click on How You Can Help. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Freudberg, the host of Humankind. I actually grew up in public radio. I've been in the field since I was 16, and from the start I was taught to offer people content that will inform and enlighten. This podcast is dedicated to spreading ideas that speak to the highest part of our listeners rather than the lowest common denominator. If you like what you hear, we're asking for your help. Please leave us a kind review on iTunes so others can find us. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks. Humankind is produced in association with WGBH Boston and supported by the Humankind Program Fund and a special grant from the Henry Luce Foundation.
Very famous cover of the Pope and his attempted assassin on the front cover of Time magazine, and it said, "Why forgive?" And in the article it said, forgiveness is a shrewd and a practical strategy for a person or a nation to pursue because it gives us what we really want, which is personal freedom.
Finding the ability to forgive others, because letting go can release the pain of the one who's been hurt. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. As the English poet Alexander Pope observed 3 centuries ago, to err is human, to forgive divine. And indeed, forgiveness is a highly prized personal virtue in all major spiritual traditions. But a Gallup poll once found that nearly 9 in 10 Americans have trouble forgiving. According to author Robin Casarjian, who has written on forgiveness, holding on to resentments can take a huge toll.
You probably pay the price of living with a level of anxiety, clearly hostility, oftentimes depression, that may not be necessary. What follows from that for a lot of people are health-related symptoms. The tension in your body, the headaches that might come on, the whatever the health implications are for that. So you just pay a high price, and it stops you from really being able to be fully present to yourself and to other relationships. So forgiving frees you. Forgiveness frees the forgiver.
Robin, I wonder if I could ask you to speak personally. Have you yourself struggled to forgive others?
Absolutely. I mean, whether it's minor or major. Major, I have been raped twice in my life. One as an undergraduate student in college and once as a graduate student in college. Now, if I did not forgive those people, now by forgiving, I'm not saying I condone their behavior. Of course I don't. I don't in any way imply that there's anything about their behavior. I mean, I was terrified. I had to go through a range of emotions. But by being able to eventually, and I think it's a process when you go through a trauma, but by being able to eventually stand back and see, wow, these people were, I would have to say, crazed when these incidents happened. Obviously, very wounded themselves. By my ability to see that, I really was able to eventually just let it go. You don't forget, but there's the emotional charge when you forgive, the emotional charge is completely different. So I don't think about that in my day-to-day life now, and haven't for years. If I held on to the resentment towards these people and wasn't able to let it go, I would have been robbed and kind of emotionally raped for years. I went to a hearing once of a parole hearing of a woman who had been raped 25 years before by this particular inmate. And this poor woman, my heart just went out to her. 25 years later, she was a mess. I felt like she was being re-traumatized by coming to this parole hearing. And because clearly she hadn't been able to work it through emotionally. So for me, those are, without question, the most dramatic experiences in my life. And I think everybody you can't be in a primary relationship living with somebody day in and day out where you're not forgiving the little things that come up, the way, a person shows up or whatever, whether it's them picking their socks up or, whatever it happens to be.
Or failing.
Or failing.
So, obviously, I'm struck by that story you just related, and I thank you so much for your honesty in sharing that. How does one do the inner work to take something as traumatizing, as painful, as shocking, as awful as that kind of experience and turn it into, I've let it go and I've forgiven the person? That sounds like quite a long distance run to do.
Well, first of all, I would certainly encourage somebody to get professional help if that situation happened to them. I think it's really critical. But, for me, David, and I have really committed myself for the last 35 years to embracing a spiritual discipline in my life. And for me, that was meditation, reading books that inspired me of all different natures, not just one spiritual path, but a kind of a wide view spoke to me. And so over the years, I just came to that part of myself that realized that, I'm not my body, I'm not my emotions. I have them, I need to honor them as part of being a human being. I see, as I said, these people as really desperate individuals. Honestly, I have prayed for their healing.
Tell me about that.
Well, if you know somebody is hurting, if it's clear to you, and no one does something like that isn't hurting, to me, extending prayer for their healing. I mean, really, I want the healing of the planet, the healing of everyone. It's not like I want to see somebody suffer. And if I have that mentality where I want to see other people suffer, what I know is that I'm going to suffer for having that attitude. There's going to be a part of me that isn't alive, that where my heart is closed.
Robin Casarjian is author of Forgiveness, A Bold Choice for a Peaceful Heart. She points out many people misunderstand forgiveness. If we interpret it to mean excusing someone's bad behavior, that can make it pretty hard to forgive, especially if the perpetrator has abused, has betrayed, or has been dishonest. But forgiveness, she says, mainly helps the person who's been wronged. And, says Robin, forgiveness is not the same as pretending everything's just fine when you feel it isn't.
There was a great article in Time magazine years ago. It was a very famous cover of the Pope and his attempted assassin on the front cover of Time magazine, and it said, "Why forgive?" And in the article, it said, forgiveness is a shrewd and a practical strategy for a person or a nation to pursue.
Shrewd.
Shrewd. A shrewd and a practical strategy. Now, most of us think of forgiveness as some kind of spiritual ideal. And it's saying shrewd. It's a choice. It's a decision. And it's one that we may really need to work on and need help processing. But it's shrewd and practical because it gives us what we really want, which is personal freedom. I think that really at the bottom line, we all want to feel free. We all want to be happy. We all want to be peaceful. And forgiveness is a means towards that for ourselves.
Some people feel an impulse to forgive occasionally goes too far. What about in the case of injustice, when vulnerable people are persecuted or abused? Should we just forgive and forget? But, says Robin Casarjian, if our response to injustice is blind rage, it could backfire, eliciting the kind of resistance that blocks progress. And if all we can do is accuse others, she says, they are more likely to shut down than open up. And there's another characteristic when finding fault is one-sided. Do you think that if I hold on to blaming someone else, that I am conveniently not looking at my own mistakes, my own infractions, my own limitations?
Well, if we get something out of holding on to resentment and we don't really look at that and acknowledge that, then consciously or unconsciously, there's a stake in holding on to the resentment. For instance, it gives me a feeling of being powerful and in control.
Sort of props me up.
It props me up. Now, that may be a very creative response to the moment, that this is the way I'm going to set my boundaries, by holding on to that anger and resentment and taking my stand. And that may be the way I need to do it at a certain point. At a certain point, however, if, a year later, 2 years later, I'm still having to be angry and resentful to set my boundaries, it becomes the law of diminishing return. How can I learn now? How can I learn to set boundaries and take a stand and be fully in myself without having to have that anger and resentment to do it? How can I set those boundaries by virtue of being in touch with my own true power rather than having the anger and resentment be the thing that is empowering me at that moment? So there are so many, and I get to control others with my anger and resentment. If you're angry enough, you are probably playing a game where you're controlling other people. It's a way to assert that you're right. It's a way to make others feel guilty. It's a way to, and I think this addresses what you were mentioning, avoid the feelings that are underneath the anger. Because if I stay out in the anger is a superficial feeling. Under that, I'm feeling vulnerable, I'm feeling hurt, I'm feeling shame, I'm feeling, could be any one of many feelings. I'm certainly feeling frightened. So we need to really look at, okay, what are the feelings that I'm feeling underneath the anger? And by holding on to resentment, I get to, as you say, I get to not take responsibility for my own feelings. I get to blame the other person for how miserable I am.
I'm better than they are.
I get to have a sense of self-righteousness. They're wrong and I'm right. Well, at some level, they may be wrong and you may be right. But by holding on to that stance and not seeing it in a deeper way, then you diminish yourself ultimately, in time in that process.
What a powerful insight that anger is a superficial feeling. Of course, speaking personally, if I am consumed in a moment of anger, it doesn't feel superficial at all. It feels like everything. But in fact, you're saying that anger is covering up lots of other things that may be hidden at that moment, but that are actually driving my reaction.
That's right. And I don't mean to trivialize in any way, shape, or form the potency of our genuine anger. But there's more to us than that. And there are more feelings going on simultaneously. And sometimes when we open to that and see, maybe for some people, it's much more, one has to feel much more vulnerable to feel the hurt and the disappointment than to feel the anger. Or maybe we don't really want to look at how frightened we are. So we're just going to feel the anger.
As a way of avoiding acknowledging where we're really at.
Right, right.
We're talking with Robin Casarjian, Executive Director of the Lionheart Foundation. It tries to bring what she calls emotional literacy to people in difficult circumstances, prisoners, at-risk youth, and teenage mothers. Her well-known book, Forgiveness, A Bold Choice for a Peaceful Heart, was one of the first publications to explore the many aspects of how people can let go of resentments. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. For more information on this segment, The Practice of Forgiveness with Robin Casarjian, please visit humanmedia.org.
So much of my work over the last number of years has been done in the prison system. And the prison population, you don't end up there because you're a high-functioning individual. You usually end up there because you're really a very wounded individual and you're using drugs to numb out your woundedness. Or when people begin to engage with forgiveness, there's a transformation that happens that allows them to heal in a very deep way. I love, there's a book called Making Good, How Ex-Convicts Reform and Rebuild Their Lives. What they saw about the people that were no longer participating in crime is that they had a fundamental shift in their own self-identity. Something very fundamental. I love the way one teenage girl put it that we were working with when we said, well, what if your friends asked you to go into CVS and rob it? And she said, I would say to them, no, that ain't me no more. That's the kind of fundamental shift I'm talking about, where it's just not you anymore. And I think when people, it's not just forgiveness, like with the prison population, but it's more fundamentally that alignment with that part of ourselves that can see more clearly, that can open up, because so many of the people that we work with in prison come from very dysfunctional homes. And when they begin to see that the things that have influenced them, begin to be able to forgive the people in their lives, knowing that, you know, that they aren't bad people having done bad things, that they're fundamentally good people having done bad things because of the impact of their histories, and can begin to forgive their parents and the situations they came from and themselves. There's something that begins to shift in them that's truly fundamental, that it really is, that ain't me no more. And that's the kind of thing that's going to get people to be able to be successful when they get out of prison, or even if they're, unfortunately, the growing number of people with life without parole sentences, even finding some meaning even behind the walls. So I just think that forgiveness becomes an overall empowering experience for people where it kind of, when they really embrace it, helps them to get back in touch with that part of themselves.
It seems paradoxical that the people who society has deemed the offenders need to be forgiving others for their own personal reconstruction, their own healing.
Well, it's in that healing that they then become able to really take responsibility for what they have done in the havoc and the chaos they've created in their own lives. As they develop more compassion and understanding for themselves, they're able to take much greater responsibility for what they've done. Otherwise, their own hearts are kind of hardened and they're lost in being a victim. And I mean, people go to prison, they see themselves as the victim. They don't see the people that they've hurt as the victim. But as they grow, then they can begin to really have compassion and understanding and begin to take the responsibility that's absolutely critical for them to take in order to truly heal.
We've considered how becoming entrenched in the cycle of feeling hurt, getting angry, and harboring grudges can emotionally trap the person who believes they've been wrong. And of course, there's another side to this transaction, the person who's done wrong, a position all of us who are human find ourselves in time and again. Let me ask about the impact on a person who has wronged another and who is then forgiven by the person they've wronged. What happens to us when we are forgiven for something that we have done?
Well, I think an enormous burden is lifted from us. And I think very often we really feel liberated, humanized. I mean, that's an incredible gift that we give to somebody. And again, it doesn't mean that we don't express our hurt and our anger and our, all of what that person's action has implied for us in our own life. But when somebody is able to offer forgiveness, it's just a priceless gift that we give to other people.
You think it brings the people together?
Well, one of the distinctions I always make when I talk about forgiveness is that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. It takes two to reconcile. It takes one to forgive. I mean, you can forgive somebody who has died, or you can hold on to resentment towards somebody who has died. Now, you're not going to be able to reconcile with that person in your life. However, that person can have a very negative impact on you 10 years after they've died if you're still holding on to that resentment. Or, again, you can, become kind of liberated by that experience of forgiving. And I do want to say also that being forgiven can be, as I said, a very, very liberating experience. But it's also very important to not let your whole life be ruled by somebody who isn't capable of forgiving you. So if you have done something and really feel the appropriate remorse and the necessary remorse and regret, and you have really taken every step you can to make reparations and take full responsibility for what you've done, but that person is not willing to forgive you, I would say simply pray for that person's own health and happiness. Allow them to have their own process and move on with your life.
What is your advice to anyone who feels really stuck in holding on to a resentment?
I would say get support. Whether that support is read some books on forgiveness. There are many of them out there. If you feel really stuck, you may want to go to a counselor or a therapist. Although I must say, it's very important to choose a counselor or therapist who really understands the virtue of forgiveness. Because there could be many counselors out there that will help you get in touch with your anger, and maybe that's where it kind of stops. Somebody who really sees the virtue of it and can give you some actual guidance in the ability to forgive. So I would say get help and do things. What do you do for yourself on a daily basis that helps you to relax, to align with that part of yourself that is the witness? Pray for your own healing. Pray to be able to release that anger and resentment. But you may need to really do some processing around it to fully own it and acknowledge it and learn. Again, if you have a secondary gain of holding on to resentment to set boundaries, well, you really need to learn how to set boundaries, because otherwise it's that anger that may be protecting you, and that's a wise thing if that's the only way you know how to set the boundaries. So I would say, it depends on where you're at, but get support if you need it.
Have you ever heard the term radical forgiveness?
Radical forgiveness for me is, as Dr. Jerry Jampolsky, who's written a lot about forgiveness, says, forgiveness is seeing the light instead of the lampshade in people. Now, I don't see it so much as seeing the light instead of the lampshade. I see the lampshade if it's there. I see if a person's being manipulative or fear-based or whatever. But to me, radical forgiveness is that ability to see the light, the core self, the fundamental goodness in all human beings, and then to go forth from that place. By forgiving, we release the past. Forgiveness is a gift that we give to ourselves.
Robin Casarjian, author of Forgiveness, A Bold Choice for a Peaceful Heart, and Houses of Healing. Her work of teaching emotional literacy to prisoners, teenage moms, and youth at risk is performed through the Lionheart Foundation in Boston. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. Studio recording by Antonio Oliart Rose. Editorial assistance from Mark Kilstein, Thomas Royal, and Kathy Graham. Webmaster Brian K. Johnson. Special thanks to Tony Buck. Our program is presented by Human Media in association with Connie Goldman Productions. Program development provided by Shart Media.
You can hear more episodes of our series at humankindpodcast.org. That's humankindpodcast.org.
This segment, part 2 of The Practice of Forgiveness with Robin Casarjian, is Humankind Program number 205.
The executive producer is David Freudberg. Please subscribe to our free weekly podcast. The title is Humankind on Public Radio. You can find it at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, NPR One, and all major podcast services, as well as through our website. Again, the podcast title is Humankind on Public Radio. And if you'd like to support our program, please visit humankindpodcast.org, and at the top, click on How You Can Help. Thank you.